get started here. I think most of you know me. I served on the NAGPRA Review Committee, was appointed by Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell in the Obama administration in 2013 and served through 2015. I was nominated by the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, which is my nation, as well as the Seneca Nation of Indians, and was really pleased and tickled to be a part of the NAGPRA Review Committee because NAGPRA is something I care very deeply about and want to do all I can to make good changes in NAGPRA. Let me pass this on. Beauty before age, Tim. Lauren, do you mind introducing yourself and when you served on the review committee?
Ang ayagukucha sakta cooking kamagala. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Peters. I served on the review committee. I took over actually for Shannon, who had to leave for a conflict of interest. And so I was on from 2016, also through the Obama administration, through 2018. I was on 2 subcommittees. We co-wrote the report to Congress. And we also had an incident in 2016 where we had to get together and look at our procedures and our ethics within the community, within the committee. I'm a second-year PhD student at UC Davis, and something that might be interest to this panel is I rematriated my great aunt from Carlisle Indian School this summer, which is not under the NAGPRA umbrella. It might be, and we can argue that maybe it should be. Yeah, that's me. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm just gonna, and I apologize, I usually don't add to people's bios, but I just want to make sure everyone knows my conflict of interest was I was appointed to the National Indian Gaming Commission as chief of staff. So I could not hold a federal position and also be a member of the NAGPRA Review Committee. So that was my conflict, and I had to resign my position. And it wasn't anything like weird or controversial. Tim, could you please?
Sure. My name's Tim McKeown. I'm a new member of the committee, but I have old experience with the committee going back to 1991. I was appointed by Secretary Bernhardt a year and a bit ago. I was nominated under the category of National Scientific or Museum Organizations, so I was nominated by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, the Association for the Anthropology of Policy, the Council for Museum Anthropology, the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology, the Society for Applied Anthropology, and the World Archaeological Congress. I was employed by the National Park Service in 1991 as the first full-time staffer working on NAGPRA on implementation of the statute. So I had the privilege of meeting and working with the first cohort of review committee members up through around 2009 when I took a different position within the department. I would like to take a second here and sort of acknowledge several of the former review committee members that are no longer with us that greatly enhanced and enriched my life. Rachel Craig, Bill Tallbull, Marty Sullivan, Phil Walker, Willie Jones, and Lee Staples. And that's me.
Thank you, Tim. And you know, you were talking about this list of orgs and entities that had nominated you. And I realized you'd probably be a good person to talk about how someone gets nominated by the secretary to the review committee to start off with, right? There's a Federal Register notice to fulfill a certain category of review committee member, either someone from a tribe who's nominated by tribal nations, religious or spiritual leader from tribal nations, and then someone who's nominated by scientific organizations. So Tim, how did you, man, you got nominated by a whole bunch of entities. So how does someone get themselves nominated to the review committee and go through that process?
It actually was pretty easy. The solicitation came out, and this actually was for the position. Whose position did I have? Oh, I'm in the long line of Dan Monroe, Jim Bradley, Dan Monroe, Alex Barker, and Patrick Lyons was immediately before me. Somebody approached me. They realized that they had heard that I had retired from federal service. Federal employees cannot be members of the committee. So I had been off for a bit, and they'd asked me if I would be interested. And I said, yeah. And they sort of took it from there to identify other organizations that would be interested in doing the nominations. I wasn't quite sure who all had nominated me until I got the notice.
And was this the first time that ATOM nominated someone?
I believe it is.
Okay, good deal. Good deal. Yeah, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Lauren, was it difficult for you, the nomination process, or was it?
It wasn't difficult. Although, you know, I'm enrolled with the Adagu tribe in the Anunga Nation, which is the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands, and we have a cultural entity called the Aleut Pribilof Islands Association, and they usually handle all our cultural issues and NAGPRA and that sort of thing. And so we have the corporation, we have the cultural center, and we have the individual tribe. And I ended up getting letters from all three, I believe, because the specification is that it's tribally, it's your tribe that puts your name forward, that nominates you. And so I finally went back to King Cove and had them write me a letter. But other than that, the process was really easy.
Yeah. And there's some process that occurs administratively once the Federal Register notice goes out and seeks nominations. The letters and nominations come in and is reviewed, and the secretary appoints. Most of us don't know what that process is, and it's going to be different for every administration, right? So I think the current review committee that sets, Tim, some of their, there'll probably be new folks coming in next year, or the terms are ending next year. There's quite a few. Is that right?
I think there are some terms that expire in May. That doesn't mean that people can't be re-nominated. Generally, the second, if you have a subsequent term, it's not for 4 years, it's for 2. Right. I can speak a little bit, at least old information, on how up till 2009, on how the nominations were handled, because I worked on that. Generally, all of the nominations are compiled with all of the resumes. There's a cover letter that's put on the packet that's sent up through the administration. Often that cover letter will recommend somebody from the program level, but that doesn't mean that's who the secretary is going to choose, because the secretary this is one of those responsibilities that the secretary has not delegated. It is one that the secretary makes that decision. So sometimes it's someone the program nominates and someone or recommends, and sometimes it's not.
Right. Great. And again, there's 3 tribal voices, so to speak. There's 3 museum or scientific institution nominations. And then there's the person in the middle that gets nominated from both sides, right? The person serving that position in the current review committee is Honor Keeler. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So, how do y'all feel? Should we get in? Should I keep firing questions at you?
One thing that I probably should have started with, but let me throw it in here. While I am a current member of the review committee, I am here in a personal capacity, and I am not representing the review committee in any way. Yes. Or the department.
Yes. Thank you, Tim. Absolutely. So before we all got on the review committee, and I'll ask Lauren this first. What expectations did you have about being a NAGPRA review committee member? And do you think let me just stop there. I'll ask you that. What were your expectations?
Well, I saw it as an opportunity to help the tribes get their people home, reuniting lands and bodies. I didn't anticipate the pushback from the museum side and the scientific side, and I guess I that's really naive of me. But I thought that by the time you got to the NAGPRA level, and the tribes are coming in and asking for your help, that the board would do all of it could to facilitate that help, whatever it needed to do. And that wasn't the case at all. It was very difficult for the tribes to get their items of patrimony back or their relatives back that I found during my time that I was there.
Wow. What about you, Tim? You probably kind of had realistic expectations already because you served in the program and Department of Interior, so you kind of had expectations already there. But do you think under the current administration and the committee now that your expectations are in line with the expectations you would have had maybe several administrations ago? Is it changed?
Yeah, I clearly was under no illusions regarding working on the committee, having dealt with the committee from 91 to 2009, including several years serving as the designated federal officer to the committee. I knew it was a demanding job, and it is.
Yeah, it really was. And I know my expectations for the review committee is I really saw it as an opportunity for almost like a think tank, but not the same purpose as what a think tank would serve, but a group of people who are highly in the know about how NAGPRA works, that are coming together at a certain level to help bring resolution to problems under NAGPRA, right? I thought it was going to be a group of individuals who were not just showing up at meetings. And what I was really sad to find out is that, it does take a lot of work. Being in the review committee and the amount of documentation that you have to review and essentially not be paid for it is really difficult. So a lot of individuals would show up at the meetings and do all of their work in front of the public, essentially, instead of putting thought and attention and having conversations before you get to the public so that easy resolution and things can happen and move on. So I was quite the worker bee, as I am now with my current board at the association. And, you know, I make people work hard, and I think I might have done that a little bit to the DFO when I was on the panel. So how do you feel? What do you feel your role was on the review committee? What do you think? What role or what purpose did you personally serve on the review committee? I'll go to Tim on this one first. What do you think your current role is? Do you feel comfortable talking about that? Like, what part do you play in the 7?
I think because for 18 years, I was lead drafter of the regulations, implementing the statute. Obviously, regulations are a horse built by a committee. There's lots of people that have input on it, but generally I was the one that wrote them all down. And then I also had a 2-year stint as a foreperson on a federal grand jury. And then 10 years post-MPS career doing litigation support to the Department of Justice on complex cases. I'm very much of a statutory literalist. So as my work on the committee, I think, is very much driven by that. Anytime there's a proposition or a recommendation or regulations, the statute's the first place I go. And I've written on legislative history, so I know that turf pretty well. But that's where I go to sort of see, before I even consider what the facts are, I make sure I know what the law is. And that's kind of the way I operate.
Yeah. And so, you know, my staff and I would kind of have review committee watch parties, right? So we watch we very much watch the review committee and to see how they think and how they're framing issues. And you definitely are the bureaucrat. You're very detail oriented in your work on the review committee. And between you and the other gentleman whose name, sorry, it's Monday and everything seems to be passing in my ears pretty quickly today. Frank McManaman seemed to have a lot of really detailed administrative type procedural discussions, which for us, not being critical of that point of view, but it's been difficult because we want to see stuff happening, right? As an activist and an advocate, we want to see, you know, the dispositions happening. We want to see, you know, really intense conversations about the regs and discussions with the people who come in for public comment and other things. And so that's from a audience perspective point of view. You know, that's one thing we've seen with the current review committee. Lauren, what did you feel about your role on the review committee and what you served?
I think my most important role, and I think for all of us, is really listening to the people that are coming in with you know, things that they want us to solve or help them with their problems that they want to solve. The public comment is really an important part of the process. And I think one thing that you learn from that as you go on, and I was only on for a little over 2 years, and I was just sort of getting a rhythm, because it does take a long time to notice what the patterns of where people aren't communicating. For example, the museums are always frustrated that, you know, the NAGPRA isn't being funded. You know, their work isn't being funded necessarily, and that's what I heard over and over again. And then I hear from the tribal side that consultation isn't being done properly, and every different community has a different way of, how they want the consult to be done. And so I think finding the disconnects is a really important part of trying to get people to communicate better.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that was my biggest role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was getting a little lost in your what you were talking about, because it really hits home. I know for me, I think someone just should have put like a soft things I could throw at people, because oftentimes I would try to fulfill that role in the review committee when institutions who were not in compliance or were not wanting to appear before the review committee. I tend to be very direct about my opinion, and I don't think this is, I'm not hiding anything here, about institutions' complacency with NAGPRA or their just failure to really work well with tribes. There was always one thing that always just upset me to no end within the review committee, because to me, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, Tim, as a lawyer. We talk about.
I'm not a lawyer.
Sorry, as a regulatory. What did you call yourself? I'm sorry. As someone who goes a statutory literalist, right? So being the statutory literalist in NAGPRA, there's been a lot of conversations about NAGPRA being a balancing of interests because of some statements by certain congressional members in the legislative history. So a lot of people read in this idea of that there must be a balancing of interests in NAGPRA and the processes and implementation of NAGPRA, where I don't see any, except for the review committee. The review committee seems to be this place in the legislation where there are supposedly both sides. But their purpose there is not to balance things out. It's to help fulfill the implementation of the repatriation provisions, right? And so Tim, what are your thoughts about this whole balancing of competing interests in NAGPRA and the function of the review committee and what it does to serve that? Or not to serve that?
Yeah, I do think that, and as you pointed out, I do think Congress, when they passed the statute, they saw the committee in particular as a place for balance. And that's why the selection process or the nomination process was structured the way it is. The 3 nominated by tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations, 3 nominated by national scientific and museum organizations. And I think just because of that structure, I think you can interpret that there was an assumption on Congress's part that there were 2 sides here and that both of them had to be represented. But more importantly, the 7th member is one that's not just selected or nominated, it's a consensus. It has to be someone that all 6 of the other members agree on. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the middle ground that they were trying to go for, I think. So in that extent, I think clearly Congress saw this as a balancing issue, and that the committee was the forefront of this balancing of different perspectives. Now, I think balancing is kind of a radioactive word in repatriation in some regards because of the way some people use it. And I think they've been characterized. I don't know if they would agree with that, but I know that they've been characterized as saying that every time that there's a claim or every time there's an issue, you have to rebalance. You have to reevaluate where this fits between tribal interests and scientific interests. And clearly, that is absurd. Congress did that for us. They grappled with that issue, and they've told us what the criteria are. And to the extent that the Congress recognized there could be a situation where the benefit to science of retaining particularly human remains was more important than the benefit to tribes. And there's a provision in the statute for that. And that would be where it's determined that the ongoing study, is of major benefit to the United States. To my knowledge, that has never been invoked, but it clearly recognizes that Congress saw this as an issue, and they built a way to resolve that, and nobody's ever used it. So to that extent, this rebalancing every time you get a claim, thinking about what the potential scientific importance might be, that's absurd.
Everyone, let's see some emojis on that. Yes. Well, what do you think, Lauren? How did you face those issues of balancing between the different members of the review committee and resolving disputes or dispositions or whatever? Did you feel like that was an issue?
Well, my bottom line was, the scientific community has stolen our stuff and our people, and they should give it back. I don't think there's ever a reason. I think the reason why that provision's never been invoked, because it's really difficult to get your stuff back and your people back. So they've never had to go that far. My job was clearly as a tribal person, to help facilitate people's return. And when you're on the committee, that is your perspective, and that is your advocacy. And the museums are strongly advocating for keeping their things and continuing the scientific study. And I found the balance in person often comes from the scientific community as well. In my case, that was the case. And so I think it still is very difficult to have your things returned. And so I don't think they ever had to use that provision.
So let me ask a question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to ask it correctly. So bear with me. So when we talk about balancing interests, and this may have, I apologize, it may have washed out of my head already. There is, if I'm being nominated by, tribal nations, foreign tribal nations, that I'm always going to side with tribal nations, and that the institutions, or those that like you, Tim, who are being nominated by the scientific organizations and museums, are always going to side with those interests. Do you think that there have been either current or past review committee members who basically look at their duty that way, is that I'm going to side with whoever my constituency is versus whatever the facts are before me?
I actually don't. I do think that there are people, if you look at the voting record of the committee on various things, oftentimes there would be a 6-1 or a 5-2 vote, and the two outlying people might well be archaeologists. I think they come at it from a different perspective, and they are looking at the details And I don't necessarily think they are rebalancing every time. They just got a different point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And the committee is designed to have that. Looking back at 30 years of review committee activities, I have to say that I think the sort of the high watermark of the committee was that first cohort. The one that Dan was a member of, Tessie Naranjo, Rachel, Phil, Marty Sullivan, I've forgotten somebody, Jonathan Haas. They came from very different perspectives, and a number of those people, particularly Jonathan, Marty, Dan, they were involved in the negotiation to pass this. They had been in the fight. But once they got on the committee, and I think that this was largely due to who the chair was, and the chair was Tessie Naranjo, and she brought a Pueblo sense of how to do things to the issue. She made sure that everything that was done by consensus. So that committee, over the long period of time, they just worked at it until they all agreed. And I think that there's a real benefit to that. And I think the more we can get back to that and not just do stand-up votes, move on, I think the better and stronger the committee will be, both in their recommendations and on the regs, and in terms of dealing with disputes and findings and things like that. Because everybody brings their own perspective, everybody flips over their own individual rocks to see what's underneath. But it's the group that, when they all come together, I think they bring a stronger and more persuasive perspective on things. Mm-hmm. I'm a consensus guy. Tessie taught me well.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I remember a time when I was on the review committee. I don't recall the issue, but I think I was taking a stronger opinion on something than others, and realized that everyone was trying to get to consensus. And when I realized that that was where everyone's head was, I basically withdrew from, I abstained from the decision so that we could move on, because I wasn't going to change my mind. But I did want, I wanted us to be effective and to be able to move on. They didn't like that too well, because I think, when you're working in consensus, you're really trying to build that unification together. And sometimes it's not always possible. So that's always an option. And that's the option that I took. Did your review committee that you were on, Lauren, have any problems making decisions or finding consensus? Was it a review committee that often voted together on most things?
No, most of our stuff was split. But we worked together well. But our bottom lines were often very different. And another thing that the review committee can do is to help advise the people that come to them. And I think when we had a disagreement of, whether a headdress should come back to the tribes, it usually was because they used the wrong angle, and it might have not been an item of patrimony, but it might have been a lineal descendant, that was trying to get their sacred items back. And I think on several occasions we had to say no, just because they couldn't prove, for example, patrimony. and we advised them on, following a different path. And eventually, they, a couple of years later, they were able to get their things back through the right pathway. And so that's something as a committee that you can do was really helpful.
So can you talk about that case a little more? Because that sounds like an interesting fact. Do you recall that case enough to talk about it?
It was a headdress. It was and a woman, it was her great grandmother's. It was being used on in a women's ceremony that had been interrupted by a massacre up on the north coast of California. And the museum that had it loaned it back to them for a time so they could continue the ceremony. But when she came to the board with her lawyer, they were calling it an item of patrimony. And it didn't quite fit under that by the way that they were arguing it. So we advised them to come back to refile as a lineal descendant. And she was able to do that a few years later. And from what I understand, she has the headdress back.
So was it an issue that the museum would not accept it as an object of cultural patrimony?
Yes.
So this is a really interesting question, because I've seen other review committees face the issue of a museum not accepting what type of item, what type of category the item falls under. And oftentimes we've seen museums not wanting to declare things objects of cultural patrimony because that means, well, it quite literally means that they probably received it improperly, right? It kind of does more than imply that in my position. So some institutions are hesitant to call things objects of cultural patrimony. But, one of the things that the association has done as the NAGPRA regulations are being reviewed right now is tried to suggest ways that the Department of Interior could amend the regulations and the definition so that it's not the museum's determination. How can it be the museum's determination that it's this item or that item when the cultural and traditional and other expertise about the object is really held by the tribe? Why should the museum be making that decision? And is there a room in the act to allow the regulations to define it differently so that the tribe can determine for itself what type of object it is, right? Those kind of questions are really hard. And if you have any questions like that in the Q&A, or you that are watching have been to the review committee and have seen issues like that, it'd be really interesting to hear more of the case studies about that, because I would have a hard time with that kind of issue with a museum decision and unwillingness just to make the repatriation happen, to force someone down a road to have to do more work and to carry a heavier burden to get an item back. It's difficult, and the questions that the review committee faces difficult. Lauren, how effective do you think the review committee is? Do you think it's an effective review body for the repatriation provisions?
I think it's important. I think it's important that people have a place to come when they have disagreements and try to work things out. I don't know what would replace it. I know that that NAGPRA has made some revisions in their policies, and I really don't know how to measure that. I measure things by, how many things can the tribes get back? How many of our ancestors can be moved out of boxes I just brought my second great aunt home from Carlisle. And how important that healing is just, you can't measure it. And, but I think it's an important entity to have. It's sort of, it's a last place that someone can stand up and advocate for themselves. So I think it's a really important.
Okay, so you know how you got out of that question, right? So I asked, do you think it's effective? So we know it's important. We know it serves an important purpose.
Yeah.
But is it effectively carrying out and really serving that purpose? Or if not, what's not working?
I think the thing that's not really working is that there's no incentive for museums to give up their stuff. And the onus is on the tribes to find their things and find their people most of the time. And the resources just aren't there. And maybe in a lot of cases, the amount of research that you have to do, that we don't have a dedicated person. I know the Aleutian Islands were spread out over 1,000 miles, and people that took our stuff and our people just said Aleutian Islands. So how do we know, where they came from? Sometimes they just say Eskimo, Alaska. We don't know where they came from. So effective to me, is measured by how much of our people we can return. And so I know there's still a lot of our people in boxes and basements, and that's just not acceptable.
Yeah. And I know it sounded like you were also alluding to the fact that the decisions made by the review committee are not binding, right?
Yeah.
Tim, what do you think about the effectiveness of the review committee?
I think it's mixed. I think the primary successes of the committee over the last 30 years, I think number one is the requirement in the statute to consult with the secretary in the development of regulations. The original cohort of the committee took that job very, very seriously and ultimately came up with draft of the proposed rule that was then circulated as a proposal and then ultimately went final in 95, which has stood up reasonably well over time. I think the two things that actually have been challenged successfully in court, one was the definition of Native American, which dropped a word or two to broaden that perspective, and one court didn't like that very much. But that was something that the committee had kind of pushed us to do. And then the second one was the inclusion of Alaska Native corporations as parties that could make claims. Again, committee members wanted to broaden the pool. So in consultation with the solicitor's office, we included that in there. Both of those ultimately did not survive in the courts. Both of those, I think, were attempts by the committee to benefit tribes. But otherwise, I think the reg stood up pretty well. And I think that's largely due to the fact that the committee worked on it ultimately with the goal of a consensus, that they agreed to put that forward. And I think that's made it a stronger document. The second thing I think is actually the whole disposition of culturally unidentifiable human remains, which Congress at the time in 1990 was unable to resolve. They couldn't get all of the negotiating parties, which included AAIA, NARF, and NCAI, working as a group. And then another group that was primarily SAA, the Society for American Archaeology, and then a third group that was AAM, the American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums. Those three organizations were doing the negotiation, and the people on the House staff said, we're not going to make any more changes unless all of you agree on them. And the disposition of the so-called culturally unidentifiable human remains was one they couldn't agree on. So Congress put in the provision to punt it to the review committee. And the review committee took a very long time to work through multiple drafts. They would circulate the drafts after every meeting. They'd collect more comments on them. And ultimately, they were able to come up with something they agreed on. And I think that was a very powerful thing they did and courageous thing they did. And that became the basis of the 43 CFR 10.11. So those, I think, are huge successes of this committee. Not everybody likes them. And I think the definition of a compromise is everyone dislikes it equally, because everybody had to give up something in order to get it across the line. But ultimately, they were able to do that. In terms of, I guess, disappointments, the fact that the review committee has this dispute and findings provision is unique in federal law. There's no other advisory committee that has that role. And I think that Congress had in mind, and those negotiating parties had in mind, that the same sort of focus that they would try to do in coming up with these other tasks, they would be able to focus on resolving disputes. And I think the high watermark of dispute resolution by the committee was actually at the second or third meeting. And this was a dispute between the University of California, Berkeley Hearst Museum and Hui Malama Ina Kapuna o Hawaii. And the meeting was held in Hawaii. And the museum was represented by Tim White, the notorious Tim White. And it was contentious. It was a really contentious issue. But the committee kept working at it to the extent that the 3-day meeting that they had scheduled was extended by another day, which caused us staff just monumental complications because we had to rebook the room, we had to change all the flights, we had to do all of that stuff. But ultimately, they reached a resolution where Berkeley agreed to repatriate directly one of the individuals, and the one that they were not willing to repatriate, they agreed that they would transfer it to the Bishop Museum and allow someone with more expertise on Hawaiian issues to make that decision. And that was done in consultation, not just between the Hawaiians and the Hearst, but the director, the bishop. The bishop agreed to this. And as a result, those remains went back. But that is dispute resolution. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is what Congress had in mind. And I think as over time, as disputes have been seen more as a quasi-judicial finding of fact, and here's the verdict, I think it has done a disservice to the process because they're not binding recommendations. And to the extent that the recommendations come out as split, they're actually not even very persuasive. Right. So I actually think that that is a place that what Congress had in mind really has not come to form.
Do you think there's a place for the secretary to do something with those review committee decisions, whether they're findings or other types of dispute resolution? Do you think there's an opportunity for the secretary to either make them binding through the civil penalty process or some other mechanism so that the review committee has more oomph? More, so it's not just about a non-binding decision that museums can just ignore and not participate in.
Well, I think if you want a binding decision, you can go to court.
Right.
There's a venue to do that. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason to reinvent that in a advisory committee. I think the way to have this advisory committee be more effective in dispute resolution comes down to resources, comes down to the amount of time that the committee spends not only familiarizing themselves with the information, but working with the parties to try to come to a resolution, not to be a quasi-judicial body.
Right.
This is my stump speech. So
no, that's good. I appreciate that, Tim. Lauren, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm sorry, I was having a hard time with my mic button. I agree. The one thing that I wished that we could do better was to really go over we had a couple days before the meetings came in for training, and a lot of that training was used for learning about the law or, that sort of thing, but not actually about, how can we resolve this? How can we work together behind the scenes to work with the tribes or work with the museums to get to a place where, not everybody is happy, but, everybody is, that you can resolve the dispute without doing it publicly and being on the record and all those things that tie your hands when you're actually in the room in front of the public. I wish there was more of that when I was on the committee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is really unusual the way, I don't know if it's unusual, but it feels uncomfortable. The amount of what happens in the public. And I know it's a transparent committee and everything is accessible, but the amount of, like you said, the dispute resolution, but also the amount of procedural work that, most of the time everyone is going, is it over yet? When's the good stuff going to happen, right? To make them more effective for public consumption. And then what about tribal consultation? How does the review committee, because I've seen, I was just trying to pull up and I can share these if you want. I was pulling up section 3006, which are the review committee provisions in the act itself. And in there, let's see, what does it say about consultation? Here it is in Part C, responsibilities of the review committee, which if you read the responsibilities of the review committee in the act, and then what it actually says in the regulations, they seem very different. And maybe, Tim, you can kind of help us understand that. But here in the responsibilities of the review committee in the act, it says consulting with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations and museums on matters within the scope of the work of the committee affecting such tribes or organizations. So it uses the word consulting with tribes and museums, which nowhere else is that in the act. There's consultation with tribes, but we've never seen anything about consulting with museums, but it is here. So how does the review committee handle that now, consulting with tribes and museums? Tim, do you all do any of that? What does it look like?
I think, obviously it's a federal advisory committee, so all of the deliberations of the committee has to be done in public. The mechanism that has been used historically, and I think is currently being used as well, is that some parties choose just to come and talk to the committee. And I would consider that consultation. We are listening to the public on issues. Other times, I know in the past, the program has sort of sponsored some work by the staff to come, or by an intern perhaps, to come forward and illuminate some issue of relevance to the committee. I know my understanding from looking at the transcripts that some of those were initiated or suggested by you, Shannon. And I think those are all good things. When they were having physical meetings, the committee looks like it's always tried to get local people to come in and talk to the committee, to illuminate to the committee how things are working on the ground. So it's part of a ongoing process to remain educated about what's going on. Not everybody is comfortable talking to the committee. I know that. Some people write letters. We get, every meeting, the materials show a lot of letters to the committee on various issues. So I think, and it's actually two ways, because a lot of times when the review committee receives documents, they all become public information. And particularly now in the web era, they're all available. So there's this flow of information back and forth. I know back in the day, prior to 2009, when I moved to OST, we used the committee, the Park Service used the committee to get information out. Because if we gave it to the committee, we had to give it to everybody. And that was by intent. There were drafts of those regulations back in 91, 92 that were circulated. We actually licked stamps and put them on the envelopes and sent them out to everybody because we didn't have web access or email access at that point. But we would send out 1,000 copies of the regs for comment. And those comments were all due 2 weeks before the next committee meeting so that they all had them. But that's sort of the way business was done. Mm-hmm. It was the mechanism by which information was given to the public. And it's also the mechanism by which information was given to the committee and thus to the department. So it's a big information conduit between the department and tribes and museums and Native Hawaiian organizations and the public.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lauren, feel free, Lauren, if you want to jump in and add anything. I could ask you all questions all day. I want to make sure that if we have any questions or conversations going on in chat or Q&A, feel free. We're gonna get to you here very shortly. I want to stop drilling you all with questions and really focus on what do you think was, I know you all talked a little bit about what was the most important thing to you during the time that you served or are serving on the review committee. But let's talk a little bit more about that. Lauren, you talked about the most important thing was just bringing ancestors home. And that was your purpose, what you saw as your purpose for your role on the review committee. Can you talk more about those 2 years and how successful you feel those 2 years were with your time there to help get that job done?
Well, I was new to NAGPRA and that type of work when I was nominated. And I felt like after my 2 years, I was just starting to get a good understanding of the procedures and the policy. And I really needed a couple more years I feel like, to be more of an effective member on the committee. And so with that short turnover, there is a time that, I didn't have 30 years behind me working with NAGPRA. So I'm sure you're much more effective, Tim, than I was. But there's definitely a learning process and sitting through the meetings and learning what different issues different tribes have, and different issues different museums and scientific communities have, and listening to what's important to all sides, and trying to get resolution for people, or if you can't get resolution at that time, at least move them forward so that they can work on some sort of resolution moving forward. So yeah, I needed a couple more years, but yeah.
It's a little bit of an intimidating job, isn't it, Lauren? I mean, do you remember your first meeting? I remember mine. I was, you get this big notebook, you get all this information, right? You've maybe watched the review committee meetings, but to be at that table, kind of on display, is extremely intimidating. And then you're supposed to be like an authority on these issues with the public, and quite often you are carrying on things that were done years prior. And they may or may not be good things. The processes, the procedures may not all be working well, and you just kind of stuck into this for a short period of time, and then the terms end, and it goes on. So there's a lot of, what did you call it? Just that, learning curve. How did you feel at your first meeting?
Well, I had a nice long talk with Melanie O'Brien and what expectations were. And my first meeting was to learn, is to go through the process and learn the process and listen. And so I felt that that went well. And it laid the groundwork for my work now. So my work and my dissertation is focusing on finding our children that were sent out to boarding schools and died away from home, because there's very little record of them, and bringing our children home and bringing our ancestors home. So I felt that it gave me a really solid foundation to move forward to, instead of getting there eventually on the NAGPRA report. It's kind of where I started, and I learned what was available to tribes and to people, and I've been able to make a lot of connections for other people with NAGPRA and advise on them somewhat. So it's given me a really good foundation.
Very good. Tim, so what is you're still currently on the review committee, but what is your, I guess, the highest purpose, if you had the foresight to look back at your review committee experience as a committee member, what do you think your highest purpose or meaning will be?
I haven't a clue.
So what do you think? So what's most important to you right now on the review committee?
The regs.
The regs. So how do you think that, can you tell us a little bit about how you're feeling that process is going, or what's going to happen?
I'd actually not, I would prefer not to comment on that.
Okay.
That gets too close to business.
Oh, okay. Yes, I understand. Well, good. Well, then that's a good stopping point. But I want to, is there anything that I should have asked you all about that I haven't, that you want to share about your time at the review committee? Either one of you. Open it up to questions. You all look silent.
I think one thing that I would like to throw out is that obviously there's a draft proposed rule out for us to focus on. And I guess putting it within the context of being a statutory literalist, I think we need to be careful to distinguish Congress's intent when they passed the law in 1990, which is what is binding here, from the broader aspirations that are relevant to 2021. Mm-hmm. And those are not necessarily the same thing. And that achieving some of the current aspirations will require amendment of the statutory text.
Mm-hmm.
And the good news is right now is the time to focus on that.
But since we don't know where the regs are going, how do we effectively focus on the statute? Because it's I also believe in statutory literalism, but I look directly to the words of the statute. And what Congress intended to say are the words of the statute, and look at those to see whether they meet aspirations or not, right? So what do you think about that, since we're so new in the discussion about the regulations? How do we appropriately advocate for amendments to the act if we're not quite sure what's going to happen with the regulations?
I think anytime you look at a draft rule, it's relatively easy for trained legal scholars to identify the things that are clearly within the intent of the statute and those that might be pushing the edge a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that in the draft or in any draft look like they may be an abuse of discretion, those are amendments to the statute. That's, I think, not so difficult to do, to identify what those are and to get those fixed.
Right.
Now, because regulations, this is back in 1991 when I first started, we had an attorney who I sort of, in the solicitor's office, who I sort of consider my legal mentor. That's where I learned the law. And his name was Lars Hanslin. And Lars was, he was a literalist. He looked at that damn statute. And if it looked like it was going too far, he pulled us back. He and I made a bet. And my bet was that $1 was that we would have the final rule published by November 16th of 1995. And I lost that bet by a month or so. But regs take a long time. It takes a long time to get a rule through because of all of the review that has to go in. And the fact that you have a review committee with a statutory obligation to consult with the secretary on development of rules means that has to be built into the equation. And tribal consultation. My understanding is that at the end of the former administration, the previous administration, the intent was to move the draft proposal directly to a proposed rule without tribal consultation, without consultation with the review committee, and to do that within the context of notice and comment rulemaking, which did not make me happy because I don't think that's what the statute says. And I know that that's not what the department's position on tribal consultation says. And to the credit of the two assistant secretaries involved here, they have made sure that the tribal consultation occurs and hopefully that the review committee has the opportunity to consult on this as well. So I have nothing but praise for those guys.
Right, and it's kind of odd that you would be betting on those regulations and when they would pass. But Lauren, any any closing words before we go to questions from the audience?
No, I'm really grateful to be on this panel, and it's, I'm not a legal scholar, so to have the legal minds listening to that has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Tim. We're gonna let's move to questions and answers. Colleen, you want me to handle this, Colleen, or are you still back there? We'll see if Colleen pops up. There she is. Do you have any questions for us, Colleen?
There I am. Yes, I have a question, and we have one question from the audience. So let's take the audience question first.
Okay.
Here it is. This question comes from Irene. What do you think would be effective incentives for getting museums to be in compliance with NAGPRA?
Who'd like to take that? Tim.
Enforcement of civil penalties.
I'll applaud to that. Yes, that's huge.
And let me I'll change that to vigorous enforcement of civil penalties.
Right.
As you may know, I am a frequent FOIA-er. I collect information generally through FOIA. I'm not interested in what tribes claim. I'm not interested in sensitive information. I am interested in how the bureaucracy behaves. So every year I request through FOIA a list, or the documents, the findings of allegations of failure to comply and the assessment of civil penalties. And the information that I've gotten says that has stopped for the last several years. Now, I do know that at the meeting on Friday, the designated federal officer announced, and program manager announced that starting maybe this week, but soon, they've finally employed a full-time civil penalty investigator. And that, I think, is huge. And I think that they should be complimented for finally doing that. But the fact that there has been no penalty or little penalty for failures to comply has really damaged implementation of this statute. So anything you could do to sort of encourage them to do this would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to me, so for one, I like the changes the Department of Interior made regarding civil penalties, and that they didn't limit them to these 9 categories. So they just said anything that's a violation of the act can be brought, for a civil penalty. But then the other thing, I think there is a problem with the act, but I've forgotten what it is now. Like I said, I'm in brain fog today, and I apologize. So let me shut up and go to, and let's ask Lauren. Lauren, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, I think it might be a good idea to employ someone from the local tribes to do the investigating on behalf of the museum. I mean, the museum doesn't have any incentive, but the tribes do have quite a bit of incentive, and maybe a position needs to be mandated that they hire somebody locally to do the investigation or to do the compliance.
Yeah, I think the only way like you said, the only way that institutions are going to comply with NAGPRA is if there's an incentive to do so, whether that is a carrot or a stick. NAGPRA's been giving carrots away, but the carrots have quit working. So the carrot has been NAGPRA grants to museums to consult and affiliate and repatriate with tribes. But what institutions have been doing with those NAGPRA grants are kind of consulting and then putting in their CUI inventories. So, not really working towards repatriation, more about looking at all the possibilities for what is cultural affiliation and getting kind of, backwards into that and unable to dig themselves out. So everything goes on CUI. So I think that's definitely a problem with the carrot. I think we need sticks in NAGPRA. We need more sticks in NAGPRA, but I think it's also a responsibility of tribes who have been kind of pushed around by institutions and museums to find a way to separate, the religious or spiritual part of the work of repatriation from actually, there in my nation, there's a traditional, there are traditional people, there are people for peace and there are people for war, right? Sometimes we have to engage those people for war to help resolve disputes or to make sure people are fulfilling their obligations that they have under whatever agreement or contract that is. And so I think sometimes we have to find ways, whether it's going to court or through civil penalty violations or bringing a dispute to the review committee, to make sure that museums are being put on the stage and in the light of day to talk about what they are and they're not doing. So that's a really good question about incentives for compliance.
The transparency issue or lack of transparency, I think, is a huge problem.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the National NAGPRA program reports going back in time, up until about, I think, 2017 or 16, I can't remember the exact date, they would at least identify the number of allegations or museums that there were allegations against and the ones that there had been a determination. And about half of them had not been investigated up to that point. And then they dropped the statistic from the report. So there's a lack of transparency even on how many allegations have been received. And nobody, the program has never identified who the institutions are. I happen to know who they are because I FOIA'd the documents. But I think that the program should say who that was. If you fail to comply and you're assessed a penalty, even if the penalty is waived, which often it is, you should at least be identified as having failed to comply. And that will increase compliance. Because right now, if there's an allegation, often it's for a number of years, it's not been investigated at all. And even if there was a determination of failure to comply and a penalty assessed, nobody but you and the secretary knew it.
So what is, Tim, are you aware of what's the reasoning behind that? Why wouldn't Department of Interior be free with that information?
I don't know.
I think that's a fabulous idea, but I think maybe there's a problem with making accusations against institutions and those accusations being found not to that they don't hold water for whatever reason. I would imagine that would be the reason not to make everything public. But I would think once, if an institution has been found not to comply, even if they've subsequently complied, we should know who that is and what their agreement with the secretary is, right? And it sucks about civil penalties because even if they are, the statute reads that the secretary may give civil penalties, monetary civil penalties, not shall, but may. That even if there are civil penalties, that money goes right into Treasury. It doesn't even feed the program, and that's a little disappointing. Just the way the civil penalty procedures work, the way they're drafted in the statute. Another point of amendment, right?
Well, I don't think that this needs an amendment. I think, and Melanie just asked the question about what in compliance means. That's a good question. I think in terms of the allegations, if there's an allegation against the museum and it has not been investigated, I don't think you want that the government should be in the position of identifying who that is, because there's been no determination on that yet. But the fact that there is an allegation or allegations have been made against 50 museums, that doesn't identify who they are, and it provides information on the scope of the problem. And it also helps in making sure that the Park Service has an investigator. Now, once the secretary or the department has determined, I guess it's the assistant secretary assigns those determinations of failure to comply, that's having not complied. And those, I think, should be public information, that information should be out there. And what the penalty was, that should be out there too. That will help ensure compliance, because everybody will know that it's not just carrots, but it's sticks too. But now there is no public knowledge that there is a stick.
Right. True.
We have another question. This question comes from Judy. Should the review committee engage in consultation with tribes about the proposed regulations to further illuminate comments already submitted?
Should they? I don't know. That's up to you. Anybody that wants to contact me to propose or to identify things that I should bring into the committee's deliberation, I'd be more than willing to do that.
And it's really weird, isn't it? Because the Department of Interior is consulting with tribes on the proposed regs, right? So would the review committee be consulting with tribes differently? Or, I'm just not quite sure how that would look or how that is feasible.
Again, what the committee is going to do, I can't opine, or alls I know is if anybody wants me to bring something up, I will appreciate it.
Any other comments on that question? We don't have any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat that I'm aware of, but I do have a personal question. I remember my very first time going in front of the NAGPRA Review Committee, and I was intimidated. I was very, very scared. And so my question is, what kind of advice do you have for those who are preparing to go in front of the review committee? I think it can be incredibly intimidating, and you feel like you're not really sure, how to present all the information or exactly what to say or what the review committee is really looking for in your presentations. And so I'm just wondering if you have any advice for those who are coming in front of the review committee.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. You go. Okay.
I was just going to acknowledge Colleen's dog. Was that not your dog? Oh, it was some other noise. Okay, I thought. Sorry.
No,
I think that was my dog.
Is that your dog? I was going to acknowledge that someone's dog is having a nap, and we're disturbing their nap, probably. Tim, we're sorry. Please apologize to your puppy for us. Sorry, Lauren. Go ahead.
The thing that I really appreciated was just heartfelt honesty and speaking your truth. And the thing that I can tell you what I didn't like, as just me personally, I didn't like when a tribe got all lawyered up and obviously paying their lawyer by the minute to pontificate about things that don't really, that have things to do with the law, but not really addressing what the core pain that the tribe is going through, that they need to be resolved. So, and I think in a certain way that I really liked the public comment, because it was someone traveling to wherever we were meeting and waiting out till the end of the meeting and standing up and speaking their concerns. And I learned a lot from that. And it also helped prepare the committee for when they were able to come present formally. We've had a relationship now, and we've had some background knowledge now about what the issues are at hand. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I was intimidated on both sides when I present to the review committee, and when I was on the review committee. And Colleen, frankly, I think that's because these are issues that are really important to us. So we want things to go well. And I will tell you, in my position on the review committee that I had, we wanted things to go well too. And we also, and I think all the review committee members understand that it's not easy to speak before a public board and know that you're being recorded and it's on the record and all of that. But it is so helpful to hear the many voices and the experiences that are happening with repatriation out there. In fact, I think the most valuable information was not though it was helpful to have federal agencies come and talk about what they're doing to comply with NAGPRA, what institutions are doing to comply with NAGPRA, all of that is important. But to me, the most valuable was to hear from tribes on the ground and the issues, the burdens and successes that they were facing as they were going through these issues, because I think those are the things, because I interpret the statute to mean that this is a statute for the benefit of tribal nations and Native Hawaiian organizations. That's who the statute was made to benefit. And so to hear those voices helps me understand how best to implement the repatriation provisions to resolve those problems, as Congress wanted to do. So to me, those are the really strongest voices that I would like to hear more of, instead of the institutions who bring along a tribal representative or the federal agencies, is more from tribal NAGPRA and historic preservation people.
And I think in terms of, there's 7 people on the committee. So when you're sitting in the table in front of them, you know what you want to say. And in my experience, all of the committee members that I know have always been extremely courteous to people that come to take the time and the effort to come and address the committee. Often at the end of that, the members will have listened to what you said, and each of them will identify something in what you said that is of interest to them. And they'll ask you questions on that. So the archaeologists are going to ask you archaeological questions. The tribal people are going to ask you other kinds of questions, but it's from that big group of people that they're trying to tease out information from what you're saying that helps them understand. So they have to put it in their framework, each of their individual frameworks, because there's 7 individuals up there. But everybody's always been nice for the most part. One guy I can think of, maybe not so much, but.
Well, thank you all. I think that's incredibly helpful to understand a little bit from the other side of the table, when you're going to present. I think that's good.
You don't want to hear who the guy is Tim's talking about?
At first, I thought he was making a joke about himself, and then I realized he wasn't. So I said I'll keep going over here and not ask.
Yeah, I've forgotten.
Okay.
So there are no more questions in the chat or in the Q&A that I can see. I did open the polls, so if you're in the audience, please take a moment to answer the polls. And I guess if we're nearing the end, maybe I can turn it back over to you 3 and ask, do you have any final comments that you want to share with the audience?
Lauren or Tim?
I'd just like to thank everybody in the audience that came and listened today. And I think we got up to about 63 or 64 or something like that. That's really impressive. And to thank the organizers for these couple weeks that have been really wonderful, and that I appreciate all of you on this panel today.
Yeah, I think anyone involved in repatriation, particularly from a tribal side, but also in the review committee, know that we have intentionally chosen a difficult path. And it's full of trials and tribulations, and the best we can do is to live up to the standards that have been set by our predecessors and the expectation of our predecessors. And I have to say that the people that I put most stock in kind of living up to those expectations and to that pattern are Tessie Naranjo and Bill Tallbull and Marty Sullivan. Those are the people that I want to try to make proud. And Dan too.
Very much so. Yeah. And so how I look at that, Tim, is a little different. I believe they've gotten us to the place where we are today, but that we must now stand on their shoulders and go beyond that. So I believe that just like the U.S. Constitution and so many other things, is how we view this in consensus and in collaboration today is going to be different than our predecessors, and that we have to strive for more, and that it shouldn't be labeled as just aspirational, because it's not. It is constantly changing and moving as we come to understand one another better and grow in our relationships together. Museums never knew they'd be in this place where they were working with tribes in such a collaborative way and actually better understanding what they have in their collections and wanting to return them back and building that relationship with tribes so that their exhibits really better fulfill their mission at public education, instead of just having sacred and cultural patrimony behind glass with a damn label on it. So I think the work that we do together has to build upon what's come before us. And what I hope this meeting has done, I'm disappointed that Dan Monroe and Rosita Worl weren't able to join us because they really have an amazing history and experience with the review committee. So what I'm hoping, or at least what the association is going to do our best to promise and hold to, is bringing together in the future a robust panel of current and former review committee members to continue to have these discussions, because I think the more we talk about this, the more we can grow together and continue to elevate ourselves higher in this work. So because I didn't choose it because it was difficult. I chose this path because it's healing, and that it will bring healing to all of those that we work with, not just tribes, but everyone involved in this work. So thank you. And I hope that we can bring another panel like this together with the review committee in the future.
Everything back.